The morning broke soft and golden over Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. It was the kind of sky that calmed even the most nervous of travelers, brushed with wisps of cloud and a faint shimmer of rising heat. The bustle inside the terminal, however, was another story. Families juggled strollers and carry-ons. Business people barked into phones, and the intercom crackled with the endless cadence of departures and gate changes. For most, it was just another morning of departures. For Sarah Mitchell, it was a moment of quiet before stepping back into a world she knew better than anyone thousands of feet above the earth, where decisions were measured in seconds and lives hung in the balance. Sarah walked briskly through the jet bridge, her crisp navy blue uniform jacket tugged neatly into place. Her co-pilot's wings gleamed on her chest, but she hardly noticed anymore. She had worn insignia far heavier in her time. Beneath the surface of calm professionalism lay a mind that never stopped calculating weather, wind speed, contingency plans. The Air Force had trained her that way, and though she'd left her call sign, Valkyrie, behind, its discipline still guided her every step. Stepping into the cockpit, she greeted Captain Reynolds, a man she respected deeply. He was seasoned, steady, and unflappable, the kind of pilot younger crew members modeled themselves after. "Morning, Captain," she said with a small smile. "Morning, Sarah. Smooth skies ahead," he replied, running his hands across the array of switches and dials. He had been flying commercial longer than she had been alive, and though age had softened his reflexes, his instincts remained sharp. Together they began their pre-flight checklist, a ritual that Sarah approached with almost reverent focus. Systems green, hydraulics stable, weather clear, along the flight path to Washington, D.C. Nothing suggested that Flight 227 would be anything but routine. In the cabin, passengers settled into their seats. A mother buckled in her restless toddler, soothing him with a juice box. A group of college students on fall break swapped stories about weekend plans in Georgetown. A man in a gray suit typed furiously on his laptop, determined to finish his presentation before takeoff. No one knew their fates would soon rest in the hands of the woman in the cockpit. Sarah leaned back in her seat as the engines roared to life. That sound never failed to stir something deep within her, a memory of fighter jets screaming down runways at dawn, the thunder of raw power contained within steel. She shook the thought away. That was another life. Today she was not Valkyrie, the combat pilot who had once flown missions over deserts and seas. Today she was First Officer Mitchell, tasked with delivering 168 passengers safely across the country. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Sarah's gaze flicked across the instrument panel, each glowing light a silent promise of safety. "Checklist complete," she confirmed. "Roger that," Reynolds said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. The plane gathered speed, the runway blurring beneath them. Sarah felt the familiar pull of gravity resisting flight, then releasing it in a surge as the jet lifted gracefully into the sky. Below, the Dallas skyline shrank, highways turned to ribbons and houses to dots. Above, the endless blue stretched out like a promise. Passengers exhaled, relieved to be airborne. Flight attendants began their well-rehearsed ballet, preparing carts and safety demonstrations. To them, this was just another flight. But to Sarah, each ascent was a sacred duty. Every takeoff carried the weight of lives entrusted to her care. The cockpit settled into its quiet rhythm. Reynolds adjusted the autopilot and leaned back slightly, glancing at Sarah. "Ever think about going back?" he asked casually, though his eyes betrayed curiosity. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Back? You know, the Air Force. Once a fighter pilot, always a fighter pilot. Must be a tough thing to let go." Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Some doors stay closed for a reason," she said softly. She didn't elaborate, and Reynolds didn't push. In truth, the memories were never far. Nights spent in ready rooms, adrenaline-fueled missions where her call sign Valkyrie was whispered with respect and sometimes fear. But those days carried ghosts she preferred not to resurrect. Flying passengers, she told herself, was different. Here, she wasn't fighting wars. She was safeguarding peace. Reynolds nodded knowingly, sensing the edge in her tone. He shifted the subject back to flight paths and weather updates, the kind of small talk that kept hours aloft from feeling endless. Outside, the horizon stretched wide, sunlight glinting off the jet's wings. The hum of engines filled the silence, steady and reassuring. In the cabin, drinks clinked in plastic cups, laughter rose and fell, and headphones sealed passengers in their private worlds. The ordinary rhythm of air travel lulled everyone into comfort. Yet Sarah, trained to anticipate the unexpected, could never fully relax. Her gaze lingered on the controls, watching for the smallest flicker out of place. She had learned long ago that disaster never announced itself with fanfare. It arrived quietly, in the blink of an eye, and only those prepared survived. She adjusted her headset and glanced out the window. Clouds drifted lazily below, glowing like mountains of ivory against the blue. For a fleeting moment, peace washed over her. Up here, problems of the world seemed small, insignificant. Borders, politics, conflicts, they all vanished beneath the endless sky. She allowed herself a breath, a rare softness in her chest. But then she remembered the faces in the cabin. The mother with the toddler, the businessman with his laptop, the students buzzing with excitement. They weren't just passengers. They were lives, each carrying a story, each depending on her without ever knowing it. The weight of that responsibility never lightened, no matter how many flights she completed. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, Reynolds glanced over. "Relax, Sarah. Nothing to worry about today. Clear skies the whole way." She nodded, though her instincts kept her alert. Flying had taught her one truth above all. Routine was a fragile illusion. One moment, you were gliding effortlessly. The next, you were fighting tooth and nail to keep the machine in the air. For now, though, Flight 227 soared smoothly eastward, the engines whispering their steady rhythm. Passengers settled deeper into seats, attendants poured coffee, and Captain Reynolds chatted about baseball scores. To the untrained eye, it was as ordinary as flying could be. But in the back of her mind, Sarah couldn't shake a gnawing unease. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the sharpened instinct of someone who had seen skies turn deadly in the span of a heartbeat. She pushed the thought aside, reminding herself that civilian flights weren't war zones. Still, as she glanced at the altimeter glowing on the panel, Sarah Mitchell Valkyrie, once upon a time, felt the faintest ripple of tension under the surface of calm. She didn't know it yet, but the clear skies ahead hid a storm waiting to break. And when it did, every second of her past would come rushing back. The plane had been in the air for nearly 2 hours when the first tremor rolled through the cabin. At first, it was nothing more than a shiver barely enough to rattle a plastic cup of ginger ale on a tray table. Turbulence was common at cruising altitude, and most passengers dismissed it without thought. Sarah Mitchell, however, noticed instantly. Her eyes flicked to the gauges on the panel. Airspeed steady, altitude unchanged, yet something felt wrong. A few rows back, a teenage boy laughed nervously as the plane dipped again. His sister clutched the armrest, while their father murmured something about just a bump. But Sarah had learned long ago that instincts mattered, and her gut whispered that this was more than air pockets. The tremor came again, sharper this time. A metallic groan echoed faintly through the frame of the aircraft, the sound of stress meeting steel. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds leaned forward, frowning at the sudden flicker across his control panel. "Hydraulic pressure's dropping," he muttered. Sarah scanned her instruments. The left hydraulic system, critical to stabilizing flaps and landing gear, was bleeding pressure fast. Her heart gave a sharp thud, though her face betrayed nothing. "Cross-check," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "Could be a faulty sensor." Reynolds toggled switches, trying to reset the system. The warning light blinked stubbornly, an insistent red eye that refused to close. Then came the bang. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't turbulence. It was a deep, gut-wrenching clank that reverberated through the fuselage, followed by a lurch that sent coffee splashing across dashboards and passengers clutching their seats. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The plane dipped hard before Sarah seized the yoke, forcing the jet to level. "Talk to me," she snapped. Reynolds' face had gone pale, his hand clutching at his chest. His words broke off into a ragged gasp. For one terrifying second, Sarah thought he was going to recover. But then his body slumped sideways, dead weight against the controls. His headset slipped askew. "Captain!" Sarah shoved him back, her pulse surging with adrenaline. There was no time to check him, no time to think about the fact that her commanding officer and partner in the cockpit had just collapsed mid-air. The plane was hers now. With one hand gripping the yoke and the other dancing over switches, Sarah fought to steady the aircraft. Warning alarms screamed, a shrill cacophony filling the cockpit. A thin curl of smoke hissed from beneath the instrument panel, the acrid scent of burning wires filling her nostrils. Behind the sealed cockpit door, passengers were beginning to panic. Masks dropped from overhead compartments with a hiss of released oxygen. Children screamed. A man shouted a prayer. Flight attendants scrambled, their practiced composure strained, but unbroken, urging passengers to breathe slowly, to remain calm. "Flight 227, Mayday," Sarah barked into her headset. Static answered. The radio flickered, distorted by the electrical failure creeping through the systems. She switched frequencies, trying again. Nothing. The aircraft bucked, jerking her against her harness. Her arms ached as she fought the controls, every muscle taut with determination. She had flown jets crippled by enemy fire before, but never a passenger plane this heavy, carrying so many innocent lives. Her training surged back, instinct taking over where thought faltered. First, stabilize. Second, communicate. Third, navigate. Always in that order. "Come on, hold together," she whispered, coaxing the jet as if it were alive. For a moment, it obeyed. The plane steadied into a shaky equilibrium. The alarm still blared, but the violent lurching eased. Sarah seized the sliver of calm to scan her captain. Reynolds was slumped motionless, his lips pale, her gut twisted. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, faint pulse, shallow breaths. Alive, but barely. A heart attack, maybe. He wouldn't be helping her bring this plane down. She swallowed hard, forcing down the panic that threatened to claw its way up her throat. There was no room for fear. Not now. Switching the intercom, she spoke, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer speaking. We've experienced a technical issue, but I have control of the aircraft. Please remain seated and secure your oxygen masks. We are trained for emergencies, and I assure you I am doing everything necessary to keep us safe." Her tone was calm, clipped, authoritative, the voice of someone who knew what she was doing, even if the plane was seconds from tearing itself apart. The cabin quieted slightly, the raw panic dulled by the anchor of her words. Back in the cockpit, Sarah reset systems in rapid succession, buying herself precious minutes. The hydraulic leak was unrecoverable. The electrical system was patchy. Communication remained unreliable. She tried again to reach air traffic control, only to hear static hiss back like a taunt. A sudden jolt nearly slammed her forehead into the console. Warning lights cascaded across the board like fireworks. Altitude dropping. Cabin pressure unstable. Her breath came in sharp bursts now, adrenaline coursing through her veins like fire. She pulled back hard, stabilizing the descent. Her knuckles whitened against the yoke, sweat dripping down her temples. This was no longer just turbulence. This was the beginning of a fight for survival. Passengers, oblivious to the full extent of the danger, clung to armrests and whispered prayers. Flight attendants braced in jump seats, stealing glances toward the cockpit door. They trusted Sarah, but trust could only carry so far when the floor itself seemed to fall away beneath them. In the cockpit, Sarah's mind sharpened into icy focus. She had seen this before. Not here, not in civilian skies, but in the burning. Deserts overseas, engines faltering, controls failing, survival balanced on instinct. Back then, her call sign had defined her, Valkyrie, the warrior who brought her crew home when all seemed lost. She wasn't Valkyrie anymore. But as the aircraft groaned and trembled around her, Sarah knew she would have to become her again. Because this wasn't just a malfunction, it was survival. And for 168 lives strapped inside a wounded jet, Sarah Mitchell was their only chance. The alarms screamed relentlessly, shrill cries echoing through the cockpit. Red warning lights pulsed across the panels, like furious eyes, demanding her attention all at once. Hydraulic failure. Cabin pressure unstable. Electrical irregularities. Sarah Mitchell had only seconds to prioritize, but her mind disciplined by years of combat sorted chaos into order. First, control the aircraft. Second, calm the passengers. Third, find a way to survive. Her hands gripped the yoke, muscles taut, the jet trembling beneath her touch like a frightened animal. She pulled against the stubborn weight of gravity, forcing the nose to rise just enough to stop their descent. The jet obeyed, leveling into a shaky glide. It wasn't smooth, but it was enough. Enough to buy her another breath. Sarah toggled the intercom. Her voice needed to carry not just words, but certainty, because fear could spread through the cabin faster than fire. She steadied her tone, smoothing out every tremor. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer speaking. The formality of the words anchored her. She had spoken them countless times before, but never under circumstances like these. We've had a system failure, but I am in full control of the aircraft. Please stay calm and keep your oxygen masks secured. We are trained for this. I repeat, this aircraft is under control. In the cabin, the words cut through panic like a lifeline. Passengers clutched their masks, eyes wide with terror, but her calm steadiness wrapped around them, tempering hysteria. A mother whispered reassurance into her child's hair. The businessman closed his laptop, shutting his eyes, his breath evening just slightly. Flight attendants, who moments earlier had been bracing themselves, straightened and nodded, ready to enforce calm. But inside the cockpit, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Sweat trickled down her temple, soaking the collar of her uniform. Control was relative. The aircraft was wounded, the captain unconscious, and her radio lifeline severed. For all practical purposes, she was alone. She glanced at Reynolds slumped in the seat beside her. His breathing was shallow, pulse faint. He needed medical attention, something she couldn't provide, not at 30,000 feet, with her hands full. Her jaw tightened. One life at a time, she told herself. Right now, 168 lives demanded her focus. The plane jolted suddenly, yawing left. She corrected instinctively, hands steady, muscles aching. The old instincts rose within her, like ghosts she had buried but never exorcised. Combat training didn't just vanish. It carved itself into bone, resurfacing when the world tilted on its axis. Her call sign echoed in her mind, Valkyrie. It had been years since anyone had spoken it aloud. Yet now, as the alarms wailed and the plane resisted her every command, she felt the persona slip back into place. Valkyrie had faced worse. Valkyrie had kept her squad alive when systems burned and skies rained fire. Valkyrie didn't break. Sarah's breathing slowed, her pulse settling into that strange, steady rhythm she remembered from missions overseas. Fear had no foothold here. There was only clarity, each decision narrowing into precision. She scanned the failing instruments, cataloging what she still had. Engines functional, though strained. Altitude shaky, but maintainable. Communication compromised. Navigation? Flickering, unreliable. Her options narrowed, but options remained. She forced her mind to leap ahead. If communication didn't return, she would need to find a way to signal distress another way. If hydraulics worsened, landing gear might fail. If pressure continued to drop, passengers risked hypoxia. Every scenario unfolded like a chessboard in her head. She had minutes, maybe less, to anticipate moves and counter them. For now, she needed to calm the aircraft itself. She reduced throttle, compensating for drag, balancing the wounded jet into an uneasy truce with the sky. The vibrations eased slightly. Not stable, but not plummeting either. She flicked to a secondary radio frequency, trying again. Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 227. En route to Washington, D.C., pilot incapacitated, hydraulic failure, requesting immediate assistance. Static. Her throat tightened. She switched channels again, repeating the call. Nothing but dead air. Come on, she muttered, slamming the switch. The hiss of static mocked her efforts. Somewhere, someone had to hear her. She tried the emergency transponder code 7700, forcing it into the failing system. Maybe ground control would see the signal even if her voice couldn't pierce the static. Maybe. The jet bucked again, sudden and violent, throwing her forward. Her shoulder slammed into the seat harness, pain sparking down her arm. She gritted her teeth and pulled back hard on the yoke. For a heart-stopping moment, it resisted, then groaned into compliance. Sarah let out a slow exhale, steadying herself. She had been here before, at least in spirit. Fighters crippled by shrapnel, radios dead, comrades bleeding. The difference was simple but immense. Back then, she had been responsible for herself and a co-pilot. Now she bore the weight of nearly 200 strangers, civilians, families, innocents. That weight pressed heavier than any mission she had ever flown. She toggled the intercom again. Her voice carried the same calm as before, though inside she was burning. We've stabilized altitude. Flight attendants, please continue to assist passengers. Remain seated and secured. A ripple of compliance spread through the cabin. People clung to her words as though they were oxygen. And perhaps, in a way, they were. Sarah adjusted the trim, eyes darting across the panels. Smoke still curled faintly from beneath the console, acrid and menacing. It wasn't worsening for now. She risked a quick glance outside. Clouds rolled beneath them, soft and indifferent, as though the world had no idea of the crisis unfolding in their fragile machine. Sunlight glinted off the wing, deceptively serene. It angered her in a way how calm the sky appeared while her cockpit boiled with chaos. Focus, she whispered to herself. Her training responded like an echo. Prioritize. Compartmentalize. Act. The radio crackled suddenly, startling her. A voice tried to break through static, garbled and faint. Flight 227. Do you copy? Her pulse leapt. She twisted the dial, straining to pull the signal clear. Say again, this is Flight 227. Pilot incapacitated. System failure. Do you copy? Static swallowed the response. Then silence. Her jaw clenched. Hope flickered someone had heard. But not enough. Not yet. Inside, she wrestled with the duality of her role. Sarah Mitchell, first officer, was supposed to stay composed, follow protocol, and wait for assistance. Valkyrie, combat pilot, knew that waiting got you killed. Valkyrie acted. Valkyrie found a way. The passengers would never know the battle raging inside her, the fracture between past and present. To them, she was simply the calm voice on the intercom, steady hands on the controls. But Sarah knew differently. Valkyrie was back, and she was the only reason Flight 227 hadn't already become a tragedy. Her eyes returned to the unconscious captain. She would need help soon. Whether from ground control, from another aircraft, or from a miracle, she couldn't carry this alone forever. But until that moment arrived, she would not falter. Because fear belonged to the passengers. Control belonged to her. And if the sky demanded Valkyrie again, then Valkyrie it would get. The cockpit hummed with the noise of strain. Metal creaked as though the jet itself knew it was wounded. Warning lights continued their merciless flashing, and Sarah Mitchell, hands steady on the yoke, knew the fragile balance she had carved out couldn't last. Every second gained was another second borrowed from a machine that wanted to fall from the sky. She had to reach someone. Sarah flicked through the failing radios again, scanning frequencies, listening to the cold hiss of static. She adjusted the dials with surgical precision, her jaw clenched, teeth grinding against frustration. No response. No beacon strong enough to lock onto. For all she knew, Flight 227 was alone in the void. "Come on, damn it," she muttered under her breath. The cockpit smelled of burning insulation, sharp and acrid. The smoke curling from beneath the console was a grim reminder that systems were failing faster than she could compensate. She tapped the transponder, checking the emergency code she had set, 7,700. It should have been flashing across radar screens somewhere. A flare in the night sky telling controllers that Flight 227 was in distress. But silence still answered her calls. Her eyes darted to Captain Reynolds. He hadn't stirred. His chest rose and fell weakly, his breath shallow. He was alive, but slipping further from her reach. She wanted to shake him, to demand he wake up and share the weight of responsibility pressing down on shoulders. But she didn't have the luxury of desperation. Not yet. Sarah leaned closer to the radio, her voice sharp, commanding. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 227. Pilot incapacitated. Hydraulic failure. Requesting immediate assistance. Do you copy?" Static. Then, for the briefest moment, a garbled voice broke through. "Flight 227, repeat." Her heart lurched. She seized the dial, adjusting. "This is Flight 227. Call sign Valkyrie." "I repeat, Valkyrie." "Requesting immediate." The signal vanished into white noise. She froze. The word had slipped out before she could stop it. Valkyrie. Her call sign. A name she had sworn never to use outside the confines of her past life. To most, it was meaningless. But to the right ears, it was a trigger, a key to a history buried beneath layers of secrecy. And once spoken into open airwaves, there was no pulling it back. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She gripped the yoke tighter, breath steadying as realization sank in. She had just identified herself, not as Sarah Mitchell, first officer of Flight 227, but as Valkyrian Air Force pilot with a reputation attached. If anyone in military command still remembered that name, it would spark recognition. And recognition carried consequences. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing herself to focus. The passengers didn't know. To them, she was still their calm, professional pilot fighting to save them. They didn't care what ghosts her past summoned. They cared only that she kept them alive. "Think," she whispered. "What's next?" The answer came quickly. Redundancy. If one path failed, you found another. If radios refused to work, you sent a signal so loud no one could ignore it. She reached for the transponder again, cycling through emergency codes. She punched in 7,500 hijacking, though inaccurate. It might at least grab attention. Then back to 7,700, reaffirming the urgency. Minutes crawled by. The jet trembled, yawning left before she corrected. The passengers behind her murmured, whispered, prayed. A baby cried, its shrill wails rising above the muted panic. The cabin was a living thing, and fear was spreading like wildfire. Sarah's headset crackled. A voice broke through clear this time. Clipped, military. Flight transmitting Valkyrie, identify. State condition. Her chest tightened. Someone had heard. She pressed the mic, her voice sharp and unwavering. "This is Flight 227, commercial out of Dallas, en route to Washington. Captain incapacitated. Hydraulic and electrical failure. 200 souls on board. Immediate assistance required." The line went silent for a beat. Then the voice returned, low and urgent. "Copy, Valkyrie. Stand by." Static swallowed the frequency again. Her stomach sank. Stand by. What did that mean? Assistance? Orders? Or scrutiny she hadn't asked for? She shook off the thoughts. It didn't matter. If military command was listening, they knew now. They knew Valkyrie was alive, flying a crippled civilian plane through American skies. And whatever response they mounted would arrive soon. She adjusted controls, fighting another shudder that rattled through the fuselage. The jet dropped 100 feet before she corrected. Passengers cried out, the cabin shivering with panic. Sarah toggled the intercom. "We're experiencing turbulence, but I have control. Please remain calm." Her voice masked the truth that the plane was unraveling faster than she could mend it. But reassurance mattered as much as control. If panic erupted in the cabin, chaos would make her job impossible. The headset crackled again. This time, the voice carried weight, authority. "Valkyrie, this is command. Fighters are airborne. Hold course." Her throat went dry. "Fighters." She leaned closer to the mic. "Negative, command. This is a civilian aircraft. Repeat, civilian. I require vectors for emergency landing, not military escort." "Vectors en route," the voice replied, clipped. "Maintain current heading. F-18s inbound." Her mind raced. Fighters scrambled, meant they had flagged Flight 227 as a potential threat. A wounded plane, no radio contact, call sign Valkyrie. It could all look like a hijacking. She clenched her fists, frustration burning through her composure. She needed help, not suspicion. She forced herself to breathe, slow and deliberate. The military would respond how the military always did, cautious, heavy-handed, prepared for worst-case scenarios. She knew because she had been on the other side of that headset once. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, echoing the words she had spoken to her passengers. "Stay calm, stay sharp." The plane groaned again, an ominous creak from the left wing. Sarah adjusted, sweat dripping down her temple. Her muscles ached, her focus sharp as glass. Every breath felt like a countdown, every second a chance for failure. She had reached someone. She had summoned aid, though not in the form she had hoped. And in doing so, she had awoken Valkyrie from the shadows of her past. Behind her, the passengers waited, clinging to hope without knowing its cost. Ahead, in the vast open sky, help was racing toward her on wings of steel and fire. And Sarah Mitchell knew that when those fighters arrived, silence would shatter, and nothing about this flight would ever be routine again. The roar of jet engines split the night over the Atlantic coastline as two F-18 Super Hornets clawed into the sky from Naval Air Station Oceana. Their afterburners lit up the dark like fire, trailing from twin comets. Each pilot knew the urgency. An unidentified civilian aircraft, crippled, possibly hijacked, flying with a call sign that hadn't been heard on military channels in years. Valkyrie. Lieutenant Commander Jake Razor Keaton adjusted his oxygen mask, eyes locked on the instruments. His wingman, Lieutenant Maria Shadow Alvarez, slid into position at his side, sleek and lethal under the moonlight. The briefing had been terse. A commercial flight unresponsive to a TC, squawking emergency codes, a pilot claiming to be Valkyrie. Their orders were simple: intercept, identify, and if necessary, neutralize. Razor's voice crackled through the private channel. "Shadow, you tracking this?" "Copy," she replied, calm but sharp. "If that's the Valkyrie, this night just got interesting." Razor didn't answer right away. Every pilot in the Navy had heard the stories. Valkyrie, an ace with a reputation for impossible maneuvers. A pilot who had walked away from the service at the peak of her career. Rumors said she'd vanished into civilian life, ghosts of classified missions chasing her. And now she was suddenly back on the net, commanding a failing passenger jet. "Let's keep the stories for later," Razor finally said. "Our job's to make sure she doesn't put 200 people and half the eastern seaboard at risk." "Understood," Shadow replied, though there was a hint of excitement under her discipline. The two Hornets leveled out at high altitude, racing toward the transponder coordinates relayed from command. The radar screen painted the struggling jet. A lumbering blip, erratic, its altitude fluctuating. To Razor's trained eye, it looked like a bird with a broken wing, fighting gravity one breath at a time. "Contact in 10, Razor said, eyes narrowing as the civilian airliner came into view against the stars. Even from miles out, he could see it wasn't flying steady. Its nose dipped and wavered, wings twitching like a hand, trying to hold steady under weight. Shadow whistled softly in the comb. "She's holding it together, but barely." They slid closer, easing into escort positions. Razor off the left wing, Shadow off the right. The airliner dwarfed them, its lights flickering, its belly shuddering through turbulence of its own making. Razor flipped a switch, breaking the radio silence drilled into every combat pilot. "Commercial Flight 227. This is U.S. Navy F-18 Interceptor. Respond if you copy. Static." Then, through the noise, a woman's voice steady, commanding, yet edged with exhaustion. "F-18s, this is Flight 227. First Officer Sarah Mitchell. Call sign Valkyrie. I have control but limited systems. Captain down. Requesting vectors to nearest safe landing strip." Shadow's eyes widened beneath her visor. "It's her." Razor felt a chill run down his spine. The tone, the cadence, it wasn't just a claim. This was Valkyrie. And she was holding a dying bird in the sky with sheer force of will. "Copy, Valkyrie," Razor said carefully. "We've got you in sight. You're not alone anymore." There was silence for a second, and Sarah's voice returned, clipped but grateful. "Appreciated, Razor, but make no mistake, we're one spark away from fire. I need that runway, and I need it now." Her bluntness tugged a faint grin from Razor. That was Valkyrie direct, no wasted words. Command's voice broke in, sharp and authoritative. "Interceptor lead, you are to maintain escort and confirm cockpit integrity." Rules of engagement in effect. Razor's jaw tightened. Row in effect. That meant if the airliner deviated from expected course, if it even hinted at being a weapon, the unthinkable would be on the table. He switched back to the private channel with Shadow. "We're babysitting a live grenade. More like babysitting the one person who might actually defuse it." Shadow countered. Inside Flight 227, Sarah's eyes flicked to her side windows. She saw them now, two dark, predatory silhouettes gliding into formation beside her. The sight sent a surge of relief through her chest, tempered by the weight of what it meant. Military eyes were on her. Every move she made would be judged, analyzed, and if misinterpreted, she and her passengers could be condemned. She pressed the mic. "Razor, Shadow, you have visual. You can see the state this bird is in. I need priority landing clearance at the nearest secure strip." Razor glanced at his nav screen, then relayed. "Valkyrie, command vectors you to Dover Air Force Base. Runways clear, emergency crews standing by. Can you hold it together for another 100 miles? Sarah exhaled through her teeth, calculating. Hydraulics were bleeding pressure. Alarms barked from half-dead systems, and the captain's shallow breathing still haunted her from the corner of her vision. 100 miles felt like 1,000. But Dover's runways were long, built for heavies, and crews there would be ready for the worst. "Affirmative," she said. "I'll hold." Behind her, the passengers felt the subtle shift of the plane correcting again. They couldn't see the fighters outside, but whispers had spread. Some swore they'd glimpsed shapes through the windows jets flanking them, guardians or executioners, depending on who you asked. Fear tightened its grip, but Sarah's voice on the intercom soothed where she could. She told them only what they needed to hear. That help had arrived, that they were not alone. Outside, Razor studied the airliner closely. He could see the scorch marks on the fuselage, the uneven wing tilt. Whoever was flying that bird was working against impossible odds. "Shadow," he said quietly, "she's dancing with death up there. And she's winning." Shadow's voice came back, steady. "Then let's make damn sure she has room to finish the dance." The 3 aircraft cut through the night in fragile formation. One crippled giant held aloft by grit, flanked by 2 blades of steel, their pilots ready to kill or die to control what happened next. For Razor, time stretched. Every second the airliner stayed level was a triumph. Every flicker of flame near its engines, every dip of altitude, twisted his gut. He knew command was watching their telemetry, ready to issue orders if the situation tipped. But he also knew something they didn't. He'd heard it in her voice. Valkyrie wasn't giving up. He pressed the com once more, letting his voice cut through the night. "Valkyrie, you're flying one hell of a fight. Hold her steady. We're with you all the way in." Sarah's reply came quick, fierce. "Copy that. But when we land, Razor, you owe me a drink." For the first time that night, Razor laughed inside his helmet. The sound was short, sharp, but it carried the weight of relief. The crippled jet, its escort, and 200 lives pressed onward toward Dover, steel hearts and failing engines bound together in a fragile covenant. And high above the darkened earth, 3 call signs, Razor, Shadow, and Valkyrie etched their defiance into the night sky. The coastline glimmered faintly below, the silver of moonlight rippling across dark waters as Flight 227 bore down toward Dover. Inside the cockpit, Sarah Mitchell's grip was iron on the yoke, her knuckles white beneath the glow of dying instruments. She had flown combat missions in jets half the size of this crippled airliner, but nothing compared to the strain of trying to coax a wounded beast with 200 lives strapped into its belly. The altimeter ticked lower. Hydraulic pressure bled away with every minute. The right aileron was sluggish, responding seconds behind her inboots. Every correction felt like wrestling a half-dead animal back from collapse. "Come on," Sarah whispered through clenched teeth, eyes flicking between the runway heading on her nav display and the warning lights screaming their protest. On her left, Razor's F-18 mirrored her descent. On her right, Shadow held tight, their formation unwavering. The Hornets looked like wolves guiding a limping deer to safety, But if that deer bolted in the wrong direction, Sarah knew the wolves had orders to bring it down. "Valkyrie, you're clear to land." Razor's voice came through the headset, firm and calm. "Runway 22 left. Winds light from the west. Fire crews on standby." Sarah nodded even though he couldn't see. "Copy, Razor. Flight 227 commencing descent." The intercom buzzed faintly as she switched channels. Her voice carried into the cabin, soft but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer speaking. We are beginning our final descent into Dover Air Force Base. Please remain seated, seat belts fastened, and follow crew instructions carefully. We'll be on the ground shortly." She didn't say if. She said we will. Words mattered. Behind her, flight attendants clutched seat backs, whispering prayers while putting on practice smiles for terrified passengers. Some held hands, others pressed against windows, wide-eyed at the faint glimmers of escort jets outside. The cabin felt like a single pounding heartbeat. Fear and fragile hope knotted together. Sarah returned her focus to the instruments. Altitude, 10,000 feet. Airspeed, dropping too fast. She adjusted the throttle, but the left engine sputtered, its response uneven. Warning lights barked again. She gritted her teeth. "Shadow," she called into the headset. "You seeing smoke off my left engine?" "Affirmative," Shadow confirmed. "She's bleeding, Valkyrie. But she's still burning hot enough to keep you aloft." Sarah drew in a steadying breath. She couldn't let fear bleed into her decisions. This wasn't combat, but the stakes were higher. Civilians didn't get ejection seats. At 7,000 feet, turbulence caught them, tossing the plane like a toy. Gasps erupted from the cabin. Sarah corrected hard, muscles screaming with the effort of dragging the controls back in line. For a moment, the plane dipped right, threatening to spiral. Razor's voice cut through the panic. "Easy, Valkyrie. Ride it out. You've got this." She clenched her jaw, eyes burning from sweat dripping beneath her headset. Slowly, painfully, she brought the wings level. The runway lights of Dover appeared on the horizon, twin rows of brilliance piercing the night. For the passengers, it was the first tangible sign of salvation. For Sarah, it was the mark of judgment too far, too close, and one mistake could scatter them across the tarmac in fire and steel. At 4,000 feet, a sharp metallic bang echoed through the cabin. The plane jolted, rattling teeth and nerves. Alarm bells shrieked. Sarah's eyes snapped to the panel hydraulics critical. The landing gear. "Damn it," she hissed. She toggled the switch. The gear indicator remained red. "Talk to me, Valkyrie," Razor demanded. "Hydraulic failure." "Gears not deploying," she shot back. A silence hung, heavy as lead. A belly landing with this much weight and fuel could mean catastrophe. Her hands flew over the backup systems, engaging manual release. She pulled the lever with all her strength. A moment passed. Then clunk. One green light. Left gear down. Another second. Another light. Right gear locked. The nose gear flickered red. Sarah's heart pounded. 2 legs, but not 3. "Command, this is Valkyrie," she called, her voice hard as steel. "We're looking at a 2-point landing, possible nose collapse. Get your crash crews ready." "Copy," came the grim reply. Shadow's voice cut in softly, almost reverent. "Valkyrie, if anyone can stick this, it's you." Sarah inhaled, exhaled, locking away fear. She throttled back, angling toward the runway, the lights growing larger, brighter, like a beacon pulling her down. "Cabin secure?" she asked through the intercom. A trembling voice answered her lead flight attendant. "As secure as it's going to be. Good. Brace positions, all of you. We're going to be fine." The lie tasted like fire on her tongue, but she forced it steady. Confidence mattered more than truth right now. At 2,000 feet, alarm screamed again. The left engine spat fire, coughing, threatening to quit. The airframe vibrated violently, as if protesting every second of flight. "Razor," she said through the headset, "if this bird doesn't hold, make sure they know I tried." There was a pause, and Razor's voice, sharp and firm. "Negative, Valkyrie. You don't go out like this. You bring her home." The runway loomed, the lights stretching wide like open arms or open jaws. Sarah gripped the yoke, fighting the unresponsive controls, the uneven drag of failing systems. The nose dipped dangerously. She hauled back, every muscle trembling with the effort. At 1,000 feet, the cabin filled with screams, prayers, tears. The escorts stayed tight on either wing, their pilots silent now, watching, powerless but present. "Easy, Valkyrie," Razor whispered across the comm. "Ease her in." Sarah's eyes locked on the runway numbers. Her pulse slowed, her vision tunneled. The chaos of alarms, the cries, even the thunder of failing engines, all of it faded. There was only her, the yoke, and the earth rising to meet them. She flared the nose, coaxing the crippled jet with delicate precision. The main gear struck the tarmac with a bone-jarring slam, sparks leaping into the night. The fuselage shuddered, metal screaming in protest. The nose gear failed to lock. The front of the plane began to drop. "Hold, hold." She snarled, forcing back on the yoke, buying every fraction of a second. The nose scraped, sparks erupting like fireworks. The runway lit up in a trail of flame. Inside, passengers braced as oxygen masks swung and luggage crashed. Screens melded with the deafening screech of metal against asphalt. But the plane stayed on the ground, sliding, grinding, but intact. Fire crews raced alongside, foam cannons blasting white arcs across the sparks. Sarah kept her hands tight on the controls until the final lurch, until the plane groaned to a halt in a haze of smoke and fire retardant. For a moment, silence hung thick, deafening, unreal. Then, a roar of relief erupted from the cabin. Applause, sobs, the floodgate of survival. Sarah slumped back, her body trembling with exhaustion, her throat raw. Her eyes flicked to Captain Reynolds. He was still breathing, still alive. She had delivered him, and every soul on board to the ground. Razor's voice came through her headset, low and steady. "Valkyrie, you did it." Sarah closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yeah," she whispered. "We did," but deep inside, she knew it wasn't over. Not with her call sign echoing through military channels again. Not with old ghosts stirring awake. The landing was survival. The aftermath would be reckoning. The roar of engines faded, replaced by the hissing of fire suppression systems and the clatter of emergency crews rushing along the runway. Flight 227 lay still at last, its fuselage blackened in patches, metal groaning under the weight of the ordeal. Smoke swirled in the cold night air, curling in ribbons across the runway as foam drenched the plane in a protective blanket. Sarah Mitchell sat back in her seat, chest heaving, fingers still clamped on the yoke. Her knuckles were white, trembling, and every muscle ached from the strain of hours spent wrestling a wounded aircraft. The cabin around her was chaos-controlled passengers shaking, sobbing, gripping each other like lifelines. Flight attendants moved quickly, ushering terrified yet grateful passengers toward emergency exits. The first to emerge were the children, held high by their mothers, still blinking through tears. The toddler from row 12 clung to his mother's arm, staring wide-eyed at the jets still hovering nearby, lights cutting across the dark sky. The college students whispered prayers. Some collapsed on the tarmac, their relief spilling into laughter and tears. Sarah forced herself to turn, taking in the entire scene. The F-18s that had escorted her to safety now circled above, their pilots scanning for any remaining threat. Razor hovered close, observing her from the cockpit as Shadow executed a slow pass to confirm the landing stability. "Valkyrie," Razor said through the headset, voice calm but carrying a trace of awe. "You've done the impossible. I didn't think we'd see the nose gear hold." A faint, exhausted smile touched her lips. "I didn't either," she admitted. Her voice was hoarse, raw from shouting orders, coaxing the engines, and steadying a panicked cabin. Emergency crews swarmed the plane, checking for fuel leaks, fires, and structural compromises. They guided passengers along the illuminated tarmac toward waiting buses and ambulances. Despite their own adrenaline, the crews moved with practiced urgency, aware that any spark could ignite tragedy. Sarah turned to check on Captain Reynolds. His seat harness was still fastened, and his shallow breathing had stabilized under the care of medics rushing to his side. Relief washed over her. He was alive, conscious enough to survive, and in capable hands. Her eyes returned to the passengers. For them, the ordeal was over, or at least, the immediate danger had passed. But Sarah knew better. Every life aboard Flight 227 had been balanced on a razor's edge. Any small failure, one flick of unresponsive controls, one misjudged correction, could have transformed the jet into a falling coffin. The aftermath was a blur of commotion. Investigators, reporters, and military personnel began moving toward the aircraft, radios crackling. Sarah felt the weight of countless eyes turning toward her. The first officer who had guided the plane, the woman who had once carried a legendary call sign through the crucible of war. Command had arrived on site within minutes. Officers approached, clipboard in hand, scanning notes and data streaming in from radar and telemetry. "Valkyrie," one said, nodding toward her with professional detachment. "We need a debrief immediately." Sarah's mind raced. Debrief meant scrutiny, questions, and the inevitable pull of her past into the public eye. The call sign she had uttered in desperation during the crisis was no longer hers alone. It had triggered recognition within military channels. She had stepped back into a world she had left behind years ago, and now she was tethered to it again. She stood, knees stiff, muscles trembling as she released the yoke. The cockpit felt impossibly large, yet claustrophobic with the weight of the past hours. Flight attendants nodded respectfully as she stepped past them, toward the runway, toward the growing cluster of military personnel. Outside, Razor's jet made a slow, low pass overhead, a silent salute to the pilot who had defied odds and gravity alike. Shadow hovered briefly, then turned back toward the base, leaving Sarah to navigate the next stage on her own. "First Officer Mitchell," Command said, eyes sharp as she approached. "We need your immediate account. Technical details, system failures, all variables. We need clarity before this reaches civilian authorities or public channels." Sarah nodded, forcing calm into her body. "Understood. I'll provide a full technical debrief. But first, let's ensure everyone's safe." That's priority one. Her words carried weight. They were not simply words, they were a promise. The passengers had trusted her, relying on a balance of skill, instinct, and nerve she had honed for years. Now, even as scrutiny turned inward, she reminded herself that the lives of those passengers, the lessons of survival, and the responsibility of command could never be relinquished. Medics guided the last passengers from the plane, helping the elderly and injured. Children clung to parents, some laughing weakly at the absurdity of surviving an impossible flight. Sarah lingered near the fuselage, watching. She could see the exhaustion etched into faces, the relief, the disbelief, the lingering fear. Somewhere beneath all of it, Sarah felt an echo of the Valkyrie within her, the unyielding fighter who had once flown missions where failure meant death. The same instincts that had guided her jet through sky and storm now resonated through every thought, every movement. She had saved the aircraft, yes, but more importantly, she had saved people. The command officer stepped closer, voice low. "We've reviewed telemetry. Your performance exceeded protocol under extreme conditions. But there will be questions, Valkyrie. Media, investigations. You need to be prepared." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had anticipated scrutiny, knew the storm awaiting her once she stepped into the public eye. But she also knew this. She had acted without hesitation, with courage, skill, and resolve. Nothing could diminish that. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the weight lifting, the adrenaline ebbing. Exhaustion threatened to pull her into collapse, but she resisted. There was still work to do, still lives to account for, still a need to document every action, every decision, every fraction of a second that had kept Flight 227 aloft. The sun began to rise faintly over the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold and pink. The storm of the night was behind her, the immediate danger past. But the road ahead debriefings, investigations, recognition, and reckoning stretched long. She would face it all. Valkyrie always did. For now, the survivors moved along the tarmac, guided by medics and emergency personnel. Behind them, Sarah watched the crippled airliner, its engines silent, its frame battered but intact. It was a monument to survival, a testament to the skill, instinct, and unyielding determination of the pilot at its controls. And in that quiet moment, Sarah allowed herself a small thought, fleeting but undeniable. Against all odds, she had brought them home. She turned toward command, ready to give her account, ready to face whatever scrutiny awaited. But deep inside, a spark remained. Valkyrie had returned, and the world would remember that name. The sun had fully risen over Dover Air Force Base, casting a pale golden light across the tarmac. Flight 227 sat quietly now, its engines cooled and silent, the scars of its night-long battle with the skies visible in charred panels, scorched paint, and bent metal. Emergency crews had completed their sweep, confirming that every passenger was accounted for, every injury treated, and the plane secured. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the cockpit, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. She had not slept, had not eaten, had not allowed herself a single moment to rest while the aircraft struggled against failure. And yet, in that exhaustion, there was a sense of quiet victory. Her eyes scanned the tarmac. Passengers were being guided toward waiting buses and ambulances, some still in disbelief at the survival of the impossible flight. Children clung to parents, still shaking from terror but safe. Older passengers held each other, sharing tears of relief. Sarah's gaze fell to Captain Reynolds. Medics had stabilized him, but his face bore the lingering pallor of trauma. She walked over and offered a brief nod. Words were unnecessary. He knew she had saved them all. Razor and Shadow landed their F-18s with precision nearby, engines roaring to a halt. Razor climbed down, visor lifted, eyes meeting Sarah's. There was no need for words. The respect between pilots was instantaneous, profound, and mutual. "You did it, Valkyrie," Razor said softly. Not many could have pulled that off. Sarah allowed herself a tired smile. "We did it," she corrected, thinking of every passenger, every crew member, every single life that had hung on her hands for hours. Behind them, military personnel and investigators approached. Clipboards were filled with observations. Pens scribbled details of telemetry, engine output, and hydraulic failure. Cameras and recorders clicked. Sarah knew the scrutiny would be intense, but she had faced it before. This time, she had the moral certainty that she had acted without hesitation, guided by instinct and duty. The debriefing began. Sarah recounted every moment. The first tremor that hinted at hydraulic failure, the collapse of the captain mid-flight, the fight to stabilize the aircraft, the desperate attempts at radio communication, and finally, the coordination with the F-18s to land safely. Every detail mattered. Every decision was examined. Questions were sharp but professional. How did she maintain control under such conditions? What emergency procedures had she prioritized? How did she keep passengers calm during a crisis that could have ended in disaster at any moment? Sarah answered succinctly, her voice calm, the clarity of her thought under pressure evident in every word. When asked about her call sign, she hesitated for a fraction of a second, the one she had uttered over the radio in desperation. Valkyrie. Recognition flickered in the eyes of several officers. Some whispered among themselves, referencing old files, old missions, and the legend she had left behind. Yes, Sarah admitted finally, voice steady. That call sign is mine. It helped me focus when nothing else would. It reminded me of my training, of what I am capable of, and what I owe to those aboard. Outside the debrief room, reporters and media crews had gathered. Cameras flashed as survivors emerged, their stories spilling into microphones. Some clutched photographs of loved ones. Others recounted the terror and relief, the miraculous calm of a first officer who had seemingly willed a broken plane into safe landing. Sarah stood aside, letting the survivors take the spotlight. She didn't need recognition. Her satisfaction came from the knowledge that the passengers were alive. That was enough. Yet, despite the chaos and attention, there was a quiet moment, a pause in the whirlwind. She stepped onto the tarmac, inhaling the fresh morning air, and allowed herself to look back at Flight 227. It had been a machine of steel and electronics, but that night it had been a living thing, and she had been its heart, its will, its lifeline. Razor approached again, his tone lighter now, almost teasing. So, Valkyrie, what now? Back to civilian skies? Or is the military calling you home? Sarah smiled faintly, shaking her head. Home is where I'm needed, and right now, that's with these passengers, these people. The rest, we'll see. Shadow nodded, admiration clear in her eyes. I hope you know the respect you've earned tonight isn't just mine or Razor's. Command knows it too. That plane didn't fall because of luck. It fell because of Valkyrie. Her lips pressed into a thin line, modesty tempered by fatigue. She had been trained to expect danger, to act under impossible circumstances, to prioritize lives over everything. Recognition had never been the goal, yet it lingered now, inevitable and undeniable. Later, as the passengers were escorted away, many stopped to wave, to thank, to acknowledge the first officer who had guided them through the impossible. Children waved small hands from the bus windows. Adults offered smiles, tears still shining in their eyes. A collective memory was forming a story they would tell for years. Of the night, Flight 227 survived against all odds. Sarah finally allowed herself to sit, leaning against the tarmac beside the plane. She could feel the exhaustion now, deep and pervasive, seeping into every bone. Yet, even in that weariness, there was peace. The storm was behind her. Every decision, every instinct, every ounce of skill had mattered, and it had been enough. In that moment, she reflected on the hours above the clouds, the trembling fuselage, the alarms, the collapsing captain, the distant static of radios. She thought of the passengers, the crew, and the F-18s that had flanked her like shadows of reassurance. Every second had been a test, and she had passed. And deep inside, Valkyrie stirred, not as a call sign, not as a legend, but as the essence of resilience, skill, and unwavering courage. She had returned, in the skies, in the cockpit, in every life she had saved. Command approached one final time, the weight of authority softened by respect. First Officer Mitchell, Flight 227 will be remembered as one of the most remarkable flights in modern aviation history. You and your crew have set a standard few could reach. Sarah nodded, letting the words settle. History, records, accolades, they mattered little in comparison to the lives saved, but they were a reminder that courage, skill, and resolve were never invisible, even if quiet for a time. As she stood and took one last look at the battered airliner, the first rays of sunlight lit the horizon, spilling warmth over the tarmac, the jets, and the survivors. For the first time that night, Sarah allowed herself to exhale fully, a release of every tension, every fear, every ounce of adrenaline. The storm had passed. Flight 227 had survived, and Valkyrie had returned, not just as a call sign, but as a living testament to what determination, focus, and courage could achieve against all odds. In the distance, Razor and Shadow taxied their F-18s back to the hangar, nodding once more in acknowledgement. Sarah smiled faintly. Whatever came next, questions, investigations, attention, she knew she had already done the most important thing. She had saved lives. And in the quiet dawn, with the air still and the survivors moving safely toward a new day, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself a small private thought. Against all odds, she had flown the impossible.